Welcome to the Philosophemes channel. This is Season 1, Episode 2, in which we discuss the basic concept of criteriology. Alright, so in the last episode we discussed the basic concept of soteriology, and now we are looking at criteriology. If we zoom out and we're looking at the architectonic of philosophy in general, we see these three basic categories: soteriology, criteriology, and ontology. We associate those with, or we can associate those with interrogative words, such that when we are asking questions, we might be able to immediately sort of indicate what category we are thinking in, or what category we are operating in. So, for example, when we say which, or if, or how, these interrogative words tend to ask for criteria, and so therefore that locates us in criteriology. All right, so as mentioned, there's a lot that I could say about this, but I just want to be very brief whenever I say that nosology, epistemology, and methodology are the three branches of philosophy that are associated with criteriology. The etymology of nosology is actually fascinating in my opinion, but for now, let's just say that very, very briefly and very quickly that nosology is the logos of gnosis, and gnosis goes back to the Greek word nous. And what's interesting about that is that it refers to originally the sense of smell. And so you get this idea that that something doesn't pass the nose test, or that something isn't intuitive. Whenever someone is speaking in that way, it's almost as if they're referring to a set of criteria that they can't quite articulate explicitly or discursively or with words, and yet at the same time they're able to make a judgment in regard to it. So really fascinating. I got to pull back on it before I spend too much time talking about nosology. But what we want to take away from this is that criteriology is a wide enough category that it does include nosology, epistemology, and especially methodology. You'll see I'm going to repeat this at the end from a different angle, but for now, just know that all three of these branches do come in the category of criteriology. All right, so the etymology of criteriology, this is made up of two Greek terms, criterion and logos. We spoke about logos in the first episode, but there is one thing that I didn't mention about logos that I really would like to say, and that is this sense of logos that comes from reading Platonic dialogues. So when you read Plato's dialogues, especially the early dialogues that showcase Socrates, and they showcase Socrates going around and asking questions of different students and Athenians. The idea here is that he is often asking someone to give him their logos. So if we think of this as the word, there's a sense in which he is saying, if we're asking about justice, what is justice? Then there's a sense in which someone may say, well, when I'm answering that question, I am providing the answer that I am carrying with me, right? I am providing the answer that is in my memory, but I think a more romantic way of sort of understanding this is to say something like it is the logos that is inscribed in your heart. I really think that this has potential to become quite beautiful or quite beautifully understood. But this sense in which, again, logos refers to the word that is in your soul. And this is important not just in a sort of decorative way, but also because whatever understanding of this philosophical idea that we're talking about, for example, justice or love or goodness or beauty, when we are thinking about the logos of these ideas inscribed in our heart or inscribed in our soul, then there is a sense in which that inscription has efficacy. And what I mean by that is that, well, I mean, if this is what I think beauty is, or if this is what I think love is, then clearly that is going to inform my actions in the world in some way, right? So when we're reflecting upon our understanding of these ideas, there is a sense in which we are revealing what it is that we are carrying around in our soul. I just think that's lovely. I have to include it. So the idea here then is that we are giving an account of criterion. And criterion here refers to a way of judging or a standard. For example, the criteria for an X to also be a Y. It's very important. I'm not going to be able to go into it in this episode, but when we get to the episode in which we talk about critical thinking and critical philosophy, then we'll pick back up with this idea. But I want to announce it here, and that is that criterion is related to the word critique. And it is related to the word critique by way of the Greek kritos, which means to pick out or to select, right? And so the idea is something like when we are picking something out, we are referring to it as a criterion for something else. And if we can, I mean, this is radically abstract, right? I mean, we're not talking about anything yet. But if we can see the logical movement at work there, then we'll be able to recognize it every time we see it. So for example, if I want to build a house, then the idea is that I need to pick out or select certain materials in order to build this house, or what to build this house with. The selection of these materials is intimately related to judgment, but it's also intimately related to the criteria that we have because we're picking out materials for a house, right? If we were picking out materials for something else, like a boat, then we would have different criteria, unless, of course, we're building a houseboat or something like this. So again, why I'm saying all these things is because in the future, we're going to look at these terms again when we talk about critical thinking and critical philosophy. And so I really want to emphasize the idea that criteriology is related to critique and judgment. So we'll get into that some more. So one of the ways in which we can summarize this for now is we can say that criteriology refers to providing an account of standards of judging or standards for judging. For example, or that is the selecting of parts composing a whole. The selecting of parts composing a whole. If you Google criteriology, what are you going to find? Okay, so the idea here is that understanding, the term understanding, what understanding refers to, should be understood as wider in scope than knowledge, or as wider in scope than knowing. So understanding includes more than knowing. Yet what is primarily being taught in universities, especially universities in America, but you could just say Western philosophy, is analytic philosophy. We'll devote an episode later to what is analytic philosophy and what types of Western philosophy are opposed to analytic philosophy. But for now, just know that analytic philosophy dominates academic university philosophy nowadays, and analytic philosophers are more concerned with knowing than with understanding. This is an unnecessarily narrow approach, but we'll critique that later. Right? So the last two bullet points here then. Whereas the certainty associated with epistemology tends to be either tautological or based on correspondence, and don't let these words intimidate you. Basically, the idea is that they are looking for some kind of certainty that, A equals A, or it is what it is. And if you are concerned with merely that kind of relation, between ideas or between things and words or things and ideas, then what you're really trying to do is just talk about knowledge. Okay, and certainly certainty is associated with knowledge, right? I can be certain that if A equals A, I can be certain that if this is an A, then it is an A, right? I can be certain of that. What is the value of that? That's a valuable soteriological type of question. In either case, let's take a look at the wider scope, and that is, let's take a look at understanding. So the certainty associated with understanding involves or is associated with coherence and revelation. So what we're looking for is not so much the statement that A equals A, but rather, how may I relate to something such that I can reveal some deeper understanding of it, right? And so when I say, how might I relate to something, notice what I'm asking for. What are the criteria, right? What are the criteria by way of which I could relate to something in order to reveal its deeper aspects? Another way to put this would be, what method, right? So we noted at the very beginning of this that methodology, the branch of philosophy known as methodology, is associated with criteriology. And so what method should I use to approach whatever it is that we are approaching so that we can reveal its deeper truths? So you can see that this is more about a kind of deeper understanding and coherence, coming up with ideas about what we are investigating that are coherent with each other, as opposed to merely identifying something in a one-to-one correspondence. So again, all of that can be very simply summed up as saying understanding is wider in scope than knowing. And lastly here, these then refer to the two typical mistakes that are made regarding criteriology. And I believe that if you start looking around for the term criteriology, you will even find in some textbooks, some of the older textbooks on logic, you will find one of these typical mistakes, right? So the first one we just mentioned is that analytic philosophers tend to ignore criteriology as the wider term and talk as if epistemology is sufficient or satisfactory for understanding philosophy, right? As if to say, anytime we talk about knowledge, all we need to understand is epistemology. We don't need nosology or criteriology. And as far as I'm concerned, they pretty much even disregard methodology. That's one typical mistake that they can make. But the other mistake is in regard to medieval philosophy and some medievalists. They sometimes treat criteriology in an overly narrow way by suggesting that it only refers to the study of certainty. However, criteria for being certain are, of course, not the only criteria which can be studied or explicated. So I think that it's very important to recognize that these are the two typical mistakes, because again, it has taken me a very long time to be able to come to these three categories in regard to the architectonic of philosophy in general. And so some of this stuff you're not going to find in the mainstream, but I think that you will find the value of this as we move forward. So again, if you Google some of these terms, or if you look in logic textbooks, you may not find these characterizations, but I stand by these characterizations. All right.